Welcome to Behind Beliefs, Behaviors, and the Brain, your communication podcast, where we bring brain science and communication strategy together to transform how we lead, connect, and thrive. I am your host, Dr. Maisha Claiborne, mom, physician, coach, consultant, and lover of all things brain and behavior. I also happen to be a trained expert in cultivating trust and safety through trauma-informed communication. Now, you may be wondering, what the heck does that mean? No worries. On this podcast, you will come to understand it all. Together each Monday, we will explore and uncover what drives our beliefs, shapes our behaviors, and influences our communication, from individual relationships to organizational culture. Each week, we dive into the science behind trust and safety, relating, communicating, and breaking through limiting beliefs that hold us back. So listen up, because whether you're a leader, a parent, a spouse, or just some amazing individual trying to get the tips for operating in your highest self, on this podcast, you will learn how to harness the power of the brain to create real change in your relationships, your leadership, and your life. Tune in every Monday morning and remember to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Now let's dive in and start reshaping communication from the inside out. It's time to transform one conversation at a time. Welcome back to another episode of Behind Beliefs and Behaviors. I'm Dr. Maisha, and I'm here with a return guest. And if you have been listening to this podcast, you already recognize this face. This is the face of my mentor, who has become my fast friend and a collaborator colleague. This is Robert Dilts. He is the founder of Dilts Strategy Group and NLP University. He is one of the OGs of neurolinguistic programming. And so I am so excited. I have to tell you, make you all laugh as the audience here, as we were talking behind the curtain today. And I said, "Are you ready?" And he says, "I'm ready to do some listening." And I said, "Oh, you can't do too much listening because we got to talk about it." So that's what we're talking about today. I mean,
Yeah.
because, a person who talks a lot about communication, y'all know me. The first thing I always talk about is listening. And so when Robert and I had this conversation, I was like, "Ooh, this is going to be a juicy one." So
Yes.
let me
Yes.
welcome you officially back, Robert. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for being back on the show.
It's a great pleasure. I'm looking forward to this, and I know we'll have, as usual, an inspiring, energizing exchange. And
Absolutely.
I'm looking forward to to both listening and talking about listening.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, for our new listeners, I would love for you to sort of just give an introduction, remind people who you are so that they know the magnanimity before them.
Well, okay. I am one of the, was involved in the early days of neurolinguistic programming. I was co-author of the first book, NLP1, and
Mhm.
have been a developer and an author since then. I think I've got somewhere around 32 books that I've written now on a whole bunch of different topics, ranging from areas of clearly of communication, but also leadership,
Mhm.
health. There's some books specifically on beliefs that I think is an important part of the important part of listening as well as communicating. And then I've been a trainer and teacher around the world, and also, as you point out, the founder of Dilt Strategy Group, where we
Mhm.
do what's called success factor modeling,
Mhm.
where we go and look at high performing individuals, teams, organizations, and we look for, as we say, the quote, the differences that make the difference. So
Yes.
what are the high performers doing that's different? And
Mhm.
one of the recent studies we've been doing is on the success factor modeling for healthcare,
Mhm.
which we're looking not just at only patient, healthcare
Right.
provider interaction, but also kind of the overall healthcare ecosystem.
Yes.
And to kind of lead into our conversation today, I do think that one of the key success factors is the ability to listen, to
Absolutely.
so, and that's also true of leadership. We
Mhm.
we have behind the scenes, we've spoken about that before as well, that good leaders know how to listen. They're not just commanders, they're
Yeah.
also good listeners.
Yeah, yeah, as you talk about the difference that makes the difference, that
Mm,
was, I think when we're talking about interaction between people, and we're talking about communication, we talk about leadership,
mm,
the difference that makes the difference, one of the biggest ones is listening.
yeah.
And I think that a lot of people think that they are listening when they are in interaction with people, when mostly they're hearing.
Mhm,
They're
mhm.
hearing with their ears, but they may not necessarily be listening. And I believe that there's a distinction. I
Yes.
often say that mostly how people listen is they're listening in the binary,
Yeah.
right from wrong, good
Right.
from bad, agree, disagree, validate, invalidate, waiting to make a point, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And that is a very filtered way to listen.
One of the things I like to talk about or point out is the notion of different levels of listening. And there's
Mhm,
a sort of this pyramid of different levels that is one of the things that I have brought into the field of NLP.
mhm,
It's this notion that there are different levels at which we interact. I can listen from a sort of purely environmental level, which means it's just more or less like noise coming from the environment.
mhm.
In that sense, it's kind of coming in one ear and going out the other.
That's right.
You can listen kind of more on a behavioral level, which means I'm just listening for we might say the content.
Mhm,
What is it about? But as you go to the deeper levels, there's this sort of level of what we say, listening at the level of how, which is more,
mhm.
I'm listening not so much for the content, but for the process
Yeah,
behind it. In
yeah.
NLP, we talk about, sort of listening to the pattern. And then you can listen at the level of belief. So, and here
Mhm,
it's, I think the idea is one level, I'm kind of just listening with my head.
mhm,
Another level, I'm kind of also engaging my heart as I'm listening,
mhm.
letting it touch me. And
Yes.
I think this is key because you can listen without ever letting it touch you.
Yeah.
And then there's also, you might say, listening from this even deeper level. We might say an identity level,
Mhm,
where you're also kind of letting it touch your gut. You're sort of listening from this place of intuition. And so I think that is also really important. There's a kind of a superficial listening, we could say, where I'm kind
mhm,
of listening for data, listening
mhm.
for information, and then kind of judging it. Or I'm more listening from a deeper level listening, where
Yeah,
I am letting it touch me. And
yeah,
I think that's where it becomes much more powerful, much more rich, and of course also, um, what I say, more profound.
yeah, yeah. I wanna dig a little deeper into these levels because
Mhm.
when as I of course, I trained under you, so these levels I've contemplated and thought about and looked at
Yeah,
all the
yeah,
different ways that this can be, this can be thought about and well, not all the different ways, but many different ways, right? And so I as you were talking about I love this place of superficial listening versus deeper listening.
right.
And of course, one of the things we know is that when you start to listen at those higher levels, it actually impacts the levels below it.
Exactly. Yes.
And so
Yes.
I think one of the things though that's interesting is that you can activate all of these various listening. So like in the listening, you can actually ask, well, what is happening in the environment that
Right.
is contributing to the specific listening? Or what
Right.
is the behavior that is contributing? And that
Exactly.
and even I think that it's valuable to listen for that process
Yes.
because then you're kind of like, "Oh, well, this is the pattern, and I recognize this pattern, and that pattern means this, that they may be coming from this context,
Yeah.
and maybe even coming from this belief system," which
Yes.
means you're really listening a little bit higher,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
I just think it's so interesting to think even about how the value that each different level brings, even when it's on the superficial level. If you're listening from that higher, if you have the skill, if you develop the skill, and this is why I think it's so important in leaders, as you
Mhm.
do
Mhm.
in families, even if
Mhm.
you're aware of these different levels of listening, then
Mhm.
you can choose to listen at a higher level that makes you aware of the value of the levels below it.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I think this idea of, um, you know, what am I listening? What am I listening for? And it's a little
Mhm.
bit for me. It's like, where am I listening from in myself,
Yes.
and where is what I'm listening to coming from in the other person, right?
Mhm.
So it's interesting sometimes. There's a process I developed with a colleague of mine, Stephen Gilligan, that we call generative coaching.
Mhm.
And big part of generative coaching is that the idea is that it's the relationship between the coach and the client that is the
Right,
most important thing.
right.
So, and a lot of times, one of the things that we will do, but we'll also teach is, as somebody speaking, especially let's say they're kind of complaining, instead of
Mhm.
going, oh, they're complaining, you actually want to sort of listen behind that.
Mhm.
Where is that coming from
Right,
in that person?
right.
And it's a whole other way of listening, instead of
Mhm.
kind of listening to the content and kind
Mhm.
of trying to make sense out of what they're saying. You're
Mhm.
going, well, where is this coming from inside this other person?
Yeah.
Where is it being generated? And here, I think one of the things that I find that's most profound, and I was thinking of it as I was, preparing for our conversation. For me, there's a whole aspect of the tone. It's because you can listen to words, but
Mhm.
listening to the tone, to me, is where sort of the emotional subtext of what's going on comes from.
Yeah.
And I think that, to me, is a key part of listening. It's not just
Mhm.
listening to the words and the content, it's listening to this whole subtext that is around it.
Yeah, and the body language too. I
Yes.
mean,
Yeah.
there's this space where we can be. I would often ask audiences, how many of you have been speaking with a person and you felt this sort of discomfort, but you couldn't put your finger on as you
Yeah.
were listening to this person, like they were saying these words to you in this tone, but you didn't. It didn't match the body language or the
Right.
facial expression,
Right.
and so there's this level of there's so much in communication outside of what the words that we speak.
Yeah.
And the skill around listening is learning to listen not just with our ears, but listen with
Yeah.
our eyes and listen with our whole body.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a whole phenomena that happens more and more today, and I notice that, like, what do they call it? It's called vocal fry. So when somebody's speaking, like, the vocal fry is, I go, well, I want you to know that my vocal, and it's like, you can tell, well, if it's coming from, it sounds like it's fried.
Right.
It's not very rich or deep.
Yeah.
And so, I do think that is another key part of listening. And, in terms of these levels, you know, uh, one of the things I sometimes will point out is, you could take the same sentence and
Mhm.
kind of bring it to a different level. If I say, I could say something like, "Wow, I really appreciate what you're saying." I
Mhm.
can say, so I could go, "Well, I really appreciate what you're saying," or I could say,
Mhm.
"I really appreciate what you're saying," or "I really appreciate what you're saying." And, so that voice, the sort of, um, you know, marking out of sort of different aspects. And I think this also kind of guides us to know, well, where do at what level am I
Mhm.
placing what I'm hearing?
Mhm.
These are also kind of important listening skills, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah. I think along with that, as we talk about these levels of listening and what allows us to be able to have that pause to be able to even ask ourselves what level of listening we have to be able to negotiate and
Yeah.
manage our own emotions,
Yes.
and it brings into this space emotional fluency or emotional
Yes.
intelligence, as some
Yes.
people call it, right? Or
Yeah.
emotional flexibility. I've heard it named in these various ways, but being aware of, okay, what's going on in my body? What is my body telling me or
Yeah.
communicating to me? And catching that and naming that and honoring that then allows us to put space between our reaction and our response and really opens up
Yes.
the level of listening.
Yeah. Well, as you were speaking, it was really bringing out for me the importance, this notion too of, we as a person, we're a whole person, but we also have different parts of ourselves. And
Mhm,
I'm often aware, and I've noticed this in conversations I'll have with like certain long-term business partnerships, that
mhm,
sometimes I'm listening more from my dreamer part. Sometimes I'm listening more from my realist part. Sometimes I'm
mhm,
listening from my critic part. And it's
mhm.
interesting, because if I'm listening from the critic, I'm, kind of listening for, okay, what's missing here? What
Yeah.
is it that's could probably go wrong? Versus if I'm listening from my dreamer, I'm kind of going, oh, well, what else? Where else could this lead? And what
Yeah.
are some of the positive benefits of this? And it's actually been very important and useful for me to recognize which part of myself am I listening from in the moment? Is it more
Mm.
the realist? Is it more the dreamer? Is it more the critic?
Mhm.
And that, I think, also helps it sometimes even to be able to name that,
Yeah.
say, "Wow, I really feel like I'm recognizing that I'm being pretty in my critic mode right now," or
Yeah.
that somebody else might be, and that I think helps to frame the
Mhm.
conversation and make it sort of, more, how do I say, more manageable, and also realizing that, well, you kind of need to incorporate all of these things at some place in order to have a fully, a rich, conversation.
Yeah, I love that. It brought to mind for me how proactive we can be in our listening, right?
Right,
So, there is like, we're going to always be in connection and interaction with people and then becoming aware in the moment. But oftentimes, there are meetings that we're going to have or conversations that we know we need to have. And,
yeah,
and we can actually begin to be proactive in before we go into conversations and choosing how we're going to listen, right?
right,
So as you're going into a meeting with a boss or with a colleague, and you say, okay, I know that part of this I'm going to be evaluating what they're saying. So
right,
I
right,
may be listening from my critic, but I
right,
also want to make sure I'm listening, at a higher level, listening
right,
from values and listening from,
right,
beliefs and listening from uh, purpose and identity. So I'm listening at a higher level, even as I'm listening as the critic, so
yeah,
that the way that listening comes across is different from if you're listening from the critic and you're at the level of behavior or you're
yeah,
at the level of environment.
right. And then it's just reactivity, right?
Right.
There's, yeah,
Exactly.
you're just and I think that's one of the biggest challenges of our world today, is that that's kind of the level at which most people listen. It's like you were saying, I'm just going to either reject it or,
Mhm.
or fully accept it regardless. And
Yeah.
I think one of the things I was thinking is, again, preparing for our conversation, I think probably one of the things that is most needed in our world today is the ability to listen. And I think
Mhm.
we see it in all of the, the divisiveness that's going on politically, but in other
Mhm.
areas, where it's just there's nobody actually really listening.
Mhm.
And yet, I think one of the deepest needs that everybody has is to be heard, right? That
Absolutely.
we all want to be heard. But the paradox is we so much want to be heard that we're not we're not open to listen, and if
Yeah.
nobody's listening, nobody's being heard, no matter how loud they're shouting. And so I
Mhm.
think that capacity to do it, like, kind of like you were just saying, is sort of be aware of ourselves,
Yeah.
going, wait a minute, what's first, let's say it starts with me.
Mhm.
One of the core principles that I find that I think is truly important is that the deepest listening comes from a sense of our own presence, right?
Yeah.
So being fully present. And I like to say, the distance between ourself and somebody else is the same as the distance between ourself and ourself. Well,
Mm.
how fully connected am I with all of me versus
Right.
just my cognitive thinking mind, let's say,
Right.
versus my heart, my emotional intelligence, or
Mhm.
intuition. So I know that when I can be fully present and I can sort of say, okay, let me attend here. Am I ready to fully listen? Or how much of me is able to fully listen? that I think is, truly one of those things that makes a difference. And I think there's a magic
Mhm.
of bringing our presence into our listening
Yeah.
because other people can suddenly tell that they are being heard.
Right. Right.
It's yeah,
Yeah, I think it's it reminds me of this, but going back to earlier part of our conversation of that binary when you're
right.
talking about like people wanting to be heard, but they're wanting to be heard so much that oftentimes they're not listening. And I
Yeah,
think that because of this sort of conditioning into the binary, the either or, either I'm going to get heard or I'm not going to get heard,
right,
as
right.
opposed to the both and of
Yes.
we can both be heard. And what it takes is
Yeah,
being willing to listen and
yeah,
dance in the
yeah,
conversation.
yeah.
And so I love that you said it all comes around with being connected with ourselves and understanding our places of that are like the wounds that we may carry, our places of
Right,
harm that we may carry, and
yeah,
how that impacts our listening. Because
right.
when we can be aware of that and we feel in our body, oh, something just got dinged or zinged,
Yeah,
then we can be able to say, okay, that may be impacting and causing me to listen a little bit more binary, more in the scarcity mindset,
right,
as
right.
opposed to moving ourselves back into this abundance. Like, okay, I can be heard, and let's dance in this conversation. And I think another very powerful thing is naming what we're hearing,
Yes.
naming what we're listening to, naming even what we're feeling in the moment as an access to opening the conversation
Yeah.
for more listening from both sides.
Yeah, I think that what you're just saying there is really the power of what I guess what's known as active listening. And
Yeah.
active listening, I'm not just kind of sitting there all silently. I am also naming what it is that I'm receiving so that the other
Mhm.
person has some idea of, okay, here's what I hear you saying, or
Mhm.
here's what, and then that you can even take it further by saying, here's what I hear you saying, and this is how that's touching me. This is
Mhm.
how I'm experiencing that. This is what
Mhm.
I know about that.
Right.
And then you can actually know, oh, well, it's not just, something that's going out into,
Right.
the atmosphere that
Right.
actually landing somewhere.
Right.
And I think that that's a good part of listening skill. So it's again, good listening is active listening.
Mhm.
And as we both know from NLP, a big part of that is also sort of attuning ourselves to
Mhm.
this notion of rapport,
Yeah.
which is not always verbal. I mean, there's a verbal aspect of rapport, which would
Right.
be like this feeding back. Here's what
Mhm.
I heard you say,
Yeah.
but also the matching things like the voice tone, the body posture,
Mhm.
key gestures. So
Yeah.
that's where you start to get this kind of resonance where then
Mhm.
you really are being heard and
Yeah.
then this magical thing happens, which is it's not just me and you. There starts to become a we, right? This
Yeah.
we where something new has a possibility of being born. It's not just
Mhm.
validating what I already think. This is the idea of a generative conversation, right? Something
Mhm.
new begins to sort of blossom out of that.
Yeah, yeah, that is so fun. It makes me think of how earlier today, and I think this happened the first time we actually connected one on one, where I was meeting a person for the first time on Zoom, and people think that the screen uh, prevents connection, but in
Right.
fact, it does not at all.
Yeah.
And I got on with this sister, and we went from hey, how you doing, into this deep discussion about love and empathy. And
Yeah.
it was like maybe 20 minutes into the conversation, and we hadn't even fully introduced ourselves. We just immediately connected. And so this idea
Yeah.
of rapport
Yeah.
and establishing that, what it does is that I mean, it establishes that connection. And I think when we are connection, we say in the world of trauma, connection mitigates trauma, right? So when we're connected, then you can't connection and suffering. It's hard to have that simultaneous
Yeah. Yes.
existence, right? The
Yes.
connection, when you're connected with people, then it allows for the listening. It allows for different listening.
Yeah. For me, I mean, one of the things that I think is important is for me, I make a commitment that I want to let what I'm hearing from the other person touch me. Right?
Mhm.
Can I let it touch me? If it
Mhm.
doesn't touch me, it's not their problem. That's my that's my choice.
Mhm.
And when you let something touch you, then there is that quality of resonance. And again, it's not always about the content.
Mhm.
It may have nothing to do with the actual content that the person is talking about is, but
Mhm.
something is touching me about that person. And then I think you start to really have that, human to human, contact that
Yeah.
transcends all the other filters and
Mhm.
barriers. Because I think we do get so caught in filters and what is called a cognitive bias, meaning I'm
Right.
only listening to what confirms what I already think. And I think that's
Right.
the binary type of listening.
That's right.
So I'm only searching for,
Mhm.
what you get in the internet. You have the algorithmic bubble. I'm only going to get fed back what I'm already looking for.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
and I think even though I can understand that there's an intention of that, the need to be heard and to be validated,
Mhm.
but it's also isolating. And I think,
Mhm.
that the need to be heard is, I think, a part of a deeper need for actual connection.
Mhm.
You cannot feel heard if there is not connection. And so
Right.
that I think that sense of connection needs to come first. And like you said, when it's there, when that resonance is there, the magic is already
Right.
is done.
It's alchemy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think too that, that sense of connection, like you said, we all really need to feel connected. And when we're able to listen in that way, and when we're able to allow ourselves to listen for commonalities and
Mhm.
listen for that connected space, then we can have these differences, and oftentimes we can celebrate or respect or honor the differences
Right.
while like seeing the sameness and seeing the connection. And that allows us to really honor the humanity in each other. It's like no one ever said you have to agree in order to listen and connect. It's
Right.
just about respecting and honoring humanity, and honoring that, well, what's different is different, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
In NLP, we would say it, always the first step is I want to get some kind of rapport, and rapport is going to
Mhm.
come from where is their resonance.
Yeah.
So there's always, I think, a first step is for good listening is I first need to find that resonance. And it's like
Yeah.
you were talking about your conversation earlier today.
Mhm.
There's this there when the resonance is there, right, then you have the complementarity means so
Yeah.
okay, there's going to be differences, but
Yeah.
that difference is held in a bigger resonance. And I
Yeah.
think this is kind of where these levels come in when we have resonance on with respect to something bigger than ourselves, then our own individual differences are not conflictual, they're complementary.
Yes.
And then, so we say you have resonance, then synergy, and then emergence. And emergence is
Mhm.
where something really new or something really special can come in.
Right.
And so I think one of the challenges is where people kind of start by kind of listening for, what's it being more guarded, well, what's different? Is there something,
Mhm.
am I threatened by the fact that somebody has a different view, has a different
Mhm.
opinion? And so I think kind of first looking for that place of rapport
Mhm.
is, I think, a really important
Yeah.
skill.
Yeah. Like, listen, it's like listening for, well, what can we agree on? What
Mhm.
do we have in common? What
Mm.
is a shared value?
Right.
Right. And we can, I believe that everyone in this world has one shared value, at
Yes.
least,
At
right? There,
least.
we even if it's good to breathe. It's
Right.
good to breathe. Let's start there. It's good to, breathing is good for the body, right?
Yeah.
That's a shared belief
Mm.
for most people, right? And
Yeah.
so, like when we find that at the highest level that we can find the shared belief or shared value or shared purpose,
Mhm.
then all the rest of, like you said, all the rest of the intricacies can be negotiated, and become. I should. It's interesting because I said and become, and I also mean and to become,
and
right?
to
Negotiated and become complementary, but
yeah,
also negotiated to become
to become
complementary,
complementary.
right?
Yeah. I was thinking as you were speaking that some of the biggest lessons that I've had in listening, I remember, and and finding that place of commonality. And I think I might have shared this when we've had a conversation before, but remember one of the most profound courses I ever took was when my my two kids were born. I took this class on listening to your baby cry, and
Mm,
it was very interesting, because the teacher came in, and we were coming in with this class on listening to the babies cry, and she says, first thing she says is, "How many of you would want you to teach your kid that it's not okay to express their feelings?" Now, of course, we're all California parents, as not us, of course not. How many of you would want your child, teach your child to feel that they shouldn't express, themselves? That we're all saying, not us. Then she's going, okay, so what do you do when your baby cries? Well, you make sure that if is it hungry, feed it.
mhm,
You fed it and it's still crying.
mhm,
Right, make sure that there's nothing bothering it. That something isn't too tight or
right,
not hurting. All right, you fed it, you've checked to make sure that it's fine. Baby's still crying.
right.
Well, pretty quickly you start going to, dun, 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 which you're basically going, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up. Saying, okay, what's the other option? Is you actually listen to it, to
Yeah.
listen to the baby cry.
Mhm,
How do you do that? It doesn't mean you're holding it like this, going, you actually hold the baby a certain distance in front of you. They call it the distance where you get what's known as limbic resonance, they say.
yes.
And you're looking in the eyes, and here's the interesting thing is, and you have to not listen from this binary place, which is, I've done something wrong.
Mhm,
This is bothering other people.
mhm,
This is where you have to be fully present, and you're just sort of, and you're making eye contact. A
right.
lot of times, initially, the baby doesn't even, they're kind of looking away.
Mhm,
You want to really make this eye contact and create this sort of container where you can hold
mhm,
whatever is going on and kind of absorb it.
mhm.
And it's the most fascinating thing. This teacher was very clever because she had us practice with other people's babies first. And
Ooh, that's that
it's,
is clever.
it's a lot easier, right? Because it's not
Yeah.
like, and it's not like I've done something wrong as a bad parent or something.
Mhm,
What happens really quickly is that you start to hear, because again, suddenly you start to hear there's a lot of different kinds of crying. And
mhm,
where's the crying coming from? What is
mhm,
that crying asking for? A lot of it is just, again, to be heard
mhm,
and to feel the presence of somebody else so
mhm,
that you're not alone in your own distress. And I think this
mhm,
is so important with trauma work as well.
mhm,
I'm not alone. And I remember after having, done this practicing, and it's also very, very interesting that when you do that, you really sense something very quickly shifts inside of you, but it also shifts
mhm,
inside of the baby.
mhm,
I remember after that class, I was having a client, listening to this client, and client was kind of going on and, complaining about something. And I started thinking to myself, God, what a big baby. And suddenly, that's right. She's a baby, I gotta listen, and I just shifted this whole sense, I started listening like I would listen to the baby cry
mhm,
instead of listen like, some adult that should know better. And it was just this amazing transformation in this
mhm.
quality of being with this other person.
Yeah.
And I think it's like that's the sort of deeper listening is, okay, I'm present. It's this human to human
Mhm,
place. And when you can get there, there's something I think that really, I don't know, it relaxes, it's a, you can feel that everything can be held in
yeah.
this place of something more resourceful, something bigger and more
Absolutely.
resourceful.
That is so funny. And what it brings up is that, when it's what you said, it's right there, baby. And what it brings up is that, everybody I often talk about Erickson's stages of development
Right, right.
and how most people are arrested
Yeah,
in an early stage of development.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so when I talk, I talk about parents communicating with children, I often talk about, like we communicate with our children like they're mini adults. And what we need to remember is that they're in a particular stage of development and their communication is perfectly aligned with the stage of development that they're in. And I really have started listening to adults that way as well, like listening for what is the language of, you know, 2 to 5, or 2 to 3, or 3 to 5, or
right.
elementary school or adolescence, and
Yeah.
hearing that, right? And
Yes,
so in myself, when I'm listening to like maybe a client that feels like they're giving me nothing but resistance, what I'm really feeling is my own resistance.
right,
And I start
yes,
to feel my body tense up and I start to
yeah,
feel, and then I'm like, oh, it's me. And
yes,
then I just like
yeah,
relax. And
yeah.
I'm like, and I acknowledge them, and then their resistance just fades away.
That's
And
so,
so I just love this whole what you talked about, this the listening, like they're a baby.
yeah. Yeah, and I think this notion that we've kind of, you know, danced with a little bit in the conversation, this notion that yes, we are an identity. We are a whole person, but that
Mhm.
whole is made up of other parts. So we're all
Yeah.
different parts, like we
Mhm.
talk about dreamer part or critic part, but
Mhm.
also there's a child part, there's
Mhm.
an adolescent part.
Mhm.
And as you say, not all of those parts have gone through the same level of, let's say, maturization,
Yeah.
maturity.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have, and I think this is what trauma does, right? Trauma
Mhm.
sort of arrests
Mhm.
a growth or a development at a
Mhm.
certain stage.
Mhm.
The idea of a whole on is that we're a whole, but we're made up of other wholes. So each
Right.
whole has got other made up of other wholes, and not all of those wholes are, at the same degree of development. And
Mhm.
so that notion of, well, where am I listening from? Where is the other person speaking from?
Mhm.
What is going to be the best place to sort of meet them so that
Yeah.
something something rich can actually happen, something can evolve, something can develop.
Yeah, yeah. There's something that I remember very distinctly from one of my trainings with you, which is when someone's speaking and you find, and I'm paraphrasing, but when they're speaking from maybe a wound, or they're speaking from a resistant place, it's like, okay, that might make sense. What
Yes,
needs to be held, heard, or healed?
exactly.
Right? And so that's the question that, we can ask ourselves is, when we're finding resistance and we're finding we just are having such a hard time listening to someone, or we're feeling activated in our body.
Yeah,
Oh, okay. What is it that is not being heard, held, or what needs to be healed?
yes,
And the same thing in the other person.
right. And it needs to be welcomed. And I think that also begins with,
Welcome.
as
Yeah.
she was showing very well,
Mhm.
instead of being judgmental, it means
Right.
becoming curious. So that going, that's interesting. All right. So
Yeah.
I'm having this reaction. That's interesting that I'm having this reaction to what that person's saying. I'm sure it makes sense. I mean, it's not
Hmm.
random, And so
Hmm.
something in me is needing to be attended to in some way,
Yes.
healed. And then that notion of welcome. And I think the
Welcome.
welcome part is
Yes.
important. And then that allows me to become curious about the other person.
Mhm.
What is it they're saying, this thing that is, you know, uh, disturbing me? I'm sure that makes sense. That's interesting.
Right.
And so then you really get the power of listening, which
Mhm.
is then something generative begins to become possible.
Yeah.
I was thinking, the another interesting example of the same teacher that was did this class on listening to the baby.
Mhm.
Also, we had a class on listening to your partner. So,
Ah, she's clever.
and had this notion of actually a listening partnership, where
Yeah.
the idea was you would spend as a practice, spend a certain amount of time every day. It could just be 10 minutes where you're listening to each other. And the idea of the listening partnership is, if we have this listening partnership, you have 5 minutes and my job is to listen
Mhm.
and not to ask any questions. I mean, I can ask questions, but not to satisfy my own curiosity
Right.
or to keep you along whatever your train of thought is.
Yeah,
And the belief being that when you can actually speak and you're being listened to, you can sort things out very quickly.
absolutely.
If you're not being listened to, you just keep going around and around in circles.
That's right.
And so it's one of these simple things that was it's so magical. Again, like listening to the baby cry instead of trying to make it shut up,
Mhm.
listening to just giving that time to listen to your partner. And it's surprising how generally after 1 or 2 minutes, the partner thinks that that's all they've said everything, but you still got
Mhm.
3 more minutes, so.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think there's something that's sort of, I don't know, deeply profound about that, needed deeply. It's both healing but also generative about that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. That is it's so beautiful. It reminds me of, so an app called Marco Polo, and
Oh,
it's a asynchronous video app. And so I
uh-huh.
have a friend who lives in Maryland, and we often talk on this app, and she's sort of like an accountability partner. And so oftentimes, we'll be chatting back and forth asynchronously, and sometimes she'll be like, "And I want to get your thoughts about such and such," and she'll be talking and talking, and eventually what happens is she works it out herself. So even
Yes.
though I yes, right. So she's talking it through, and even though I'm not listening in the moment, I'm listening asynchronously. That space of uninterrupted know
Yes.
that I'm going to listen
Yes.
is
Yes.
what allows her to talk that through, and I think that's also the beauty of coaching
Yeah.
when you're in that pure coach space of listening, it's pulling for the solution inside of the other person. So,
Yes.
oh my goodness, you
Wow.
know, we could talk all
I
day.
know, I know.
We
Yeah.
can
I
all
can
day.
listen all you can talk all day because you have a good listen. You're really good listen.
Exactly, exactly. That is what happens when you have good listeners in the room. The conversation can go for hours
Yeah.
because and it's generating. It's like
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
just generating more and more.
Yeah.
And yes, we might need to do a part three.
You have to do part of well, sure, I would anytime, anytime.
You're gonna be my recurring guest host. Is what's gonna
Uh,
Oh,
mm,
well, you know what? I love this conversation. And I just want to, I always like to ask, like, if you were to leave the audience with one or two things as it pertains to listening,
mhm.
what would you want them to just take away from this conversation?
Yeah, I think one of the key things that has come out in a number of times in what we said is it starts with myself, right? I need
Mhm.
to be ready to listen.
Yeah.
And I need to be self-aware. I think it's this idea that the distance between me and that other person starts with the distance between me and myself.
Yeah.
If I'm just up in my head, I'm not going to be able to connect with them any more deeply than that.
Yeah.
So it actually starts with a kind of I don't know what you might say, like an inner listening. How much of
Mhm.
me is present here, and available and willing to actually
Mhm.
listen,
Yeah.
and not judge, and not from the binary place, but from
Yeah.
this place of what we were saying, curiosity,
Mhm.
of genuine, interest and welcoming. So I think that's the first thing. And then this idea of what we're listening for, what we're listening
Mhm.
to. Is it just the person's content? Is it their belief system I'm listening
Mhm.
to, or is it
Mhm.
something deeper than that, something beyond that?
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of that starts with what's the purpose of our
Mhm.
conversation.
Yeah.
If it's just to get directions, that's one thing.
Right. That's what
If it's a conversation where there is some kind of potential conflict,
Mhm.
or where it's a coaching conversation,
Mhm.
and I think it all starts with our ability to prepare ourselves
Mhm.
to you know to and to be aware of ourselves. I think
Mhm.
self-awareness is always going to be
Yeah.
piece. So I think that would be my one of my takeaways then.
Gold, gold and pearls and diamonds. Well, I mean, thank you so much for this conversation. As always, it fills me, it
And you,
enriches me, it enlivens me, it energizes me when we have our conversations. I'd love for you to share with the audience if they are in an organization and they want you to come and consult or speak,
yeah,
or if they are interested in maybe learning more about your trainings, like
yeah.
tell the audience, how can they reach you?
So the best way is through, I have a website, which is the easiest way to get there is robertdilts.com, but an even simpler, if you want a fewer numbers, is nlpu.com. They kind of go to the same place.
Yeah.
I also have another website that does relate a lot to the success factor modeling work. That's
Mhm.
diltsstrategygroup.com.
And we will
So,
have all of those in the show notes, y'all. No worries.
oh,
Well, it was a pleasure,
yeah,
once again to have you here. And of course, I'd like to thank the audience because
yes.
without
For
the audience,
listening.
yes, for listening. Thank you for listening. Because of course, without the audience listening, there is no podcast. I invite you to share this episode, please, 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 because listening is really the foundation of our interaction with each other, of communication. And so share this with a friend, a family member, a colleague, and don't forget to subscribe so that you can be aware of all the new episodes like this one. And finally, leave a review, leave a comment because we want to know that we're making a difference because that is what this podcast is all about. That's what our life's work is all about, making a
A
difference.
difference that makes a difference.
That being the difference that makes a difference. So make sure you let us know by leaving a comment for us on the podcast. And with that, once again, I'm sharing my love and appreciation to you, Robert, for being with us. Yes, yes. And for the audience, until the next time we see you, stay empowered. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. We truly appreciate our listeners because without you, there is no podcast. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode and that it gave you fresh insights and practical tools to elevate your communication and build trust and safety in all areas of your life, from leading your teams to strengthening your relationships at home. If today's conversation resonated with you, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, share this episode, and leave us a 5-star review. Your support helps us reach more people looking to enhance their relationships, their leadership, and the communication in every area of their life. If you are ready to take your communication to the next level, I encourage you to check out our Communication That Transforms online course. This course dives deep into creating psychological safety, mastering trauma-informed communication that allows you to build behavioral flexibility and tackle any circumstance in your life. You'll learn practical strategies for handling difficult conversations, navigating conflict, and cultivating trust in a way that truly resonates with the people around you and leaves them feeling seen, heard, respected, valued, and welcome. This course is designed to help you transform not only how you lead, but how you show up in all your relationships, whether in the boardroom with your teams or at home with your family. Check out the course at mindremappingacademy.com/TICC to learn more, see the full course catalog, and register. This link will also be in the show notes. That's www.mindremappingacademy.com/TICC. Finally, if these topics resonate with you and you want to bring them to your department, your team, or your organization, I'd love to speak with you. Reach out to me and invite me in for a workshop or a conference tailored to elevate your organization's trust, collaboration, communication, safety, and belonging. You can learn more and reach out to me by visiting mindremappingacademy.com/corporate-programs. Remember, change happens one intentional conversation at a time. With one small shift in how we connect, listen, and lead. Keep listening with intention and communicating with clarity. And until the next episode, stay empowered.